Hi, Andrew. How are you today?
Hey Daniela, I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Good to see you. I'm really excited to have you on the show today. So thank you for being here.
Absolutely. It's good to see you as well. And thank you so much for having me. And
Yeah,
congrats
of
on
course.
launching the next collector. This is super exciting for you. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this.
Thank you. Well, today is a really special day for a few reasons. One, yesterday you kind of relaunched your own personal watch brand, Waldan Watches. And two, it's your birthday today. So
Yeah.
happy birthday.
Thank you so much.
How old are you now? 45, 46?
54.
Yeah, okay, okay. That's what I thought. So,
In
no, but
advance.
happy birthday. My birthday gift to you is making you talk about watches and being filmed while doing it. So, you're welcome.
I couldn't ask for a better present.
Okay, good. So, I'm really excited to have you here today because I think you have one of the coolest stories in the watch industry that maybe not so many people know about, but is so interesting and has shaped you as a collector and a businessman and as a person. And I want to dive into that a little bit today. And so, if you could start and tell us a little bit about your history, your family history, and how you've kind of built up to this brand launch that you basically relaunched yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to talk about it. So I guess it really all starts before me. It starts with my father. My father was, in summary, a Polish Holocaust survivor who learned watchmaking in the concentration camp that he was in as a means of survival. He had always had a fascination with watches since he was a little kid. Actually, when he was very young, he found his father's pocket watch and disassembled the whole thing with the butter knife, which completely just destroyed and broke the watch. But as he disassembled the entire watch, he was making and drawing his own diagrams as to how he thought all the parts fit together. So after his experiences in the war, he came to the US in 1946 and made watchmaking and horology his entire life, since that was all that he had pretty much had left. And by the 1950s, went back to Switzerland and had worked in various positions for the Tissot Company, Universal Genève. He worked with Van Cleef and Arpels, at Tiffany's, and later did consulting work with companies like Ebel and Rolex. And for myself, I was literally born into the industry. The kind of running joke in the office is that the first time that I went to Basel was in a stroller, which
That's
actually,
pretty unique. That's pretty unique.
absolutely. I was going to say it's embarrassingly true. Starting from 9, 10 years old, I was translating correspondence from Switzerland to the US and, the US back, in the office for my father. And as that grew, my mother is also in the industry. She started out working for the family business, when her and my father got married, and then eventually went to work for Movado and now works for Wempe as an advertising executive. So there have been different facets of the industry that I've always been exposed to with both parents being around. I've always just kind of been surrounded by everything watches.
That is so cool. And I love that story. It's really unique to you and your family. And you literally were born into the industry and kind of were able to see all the different facets of the behind the scenes while also the business side as well, which I think is really special and has probably shaped, how you've built your own brand today, despite your history of literally being born into the watch industry. So you were going to have exposure to watches, whether you liked it or not, right? And you happen to
Absolutely.
like them, which is good, but you didn't really start collecting until about 5 years ago. And so how did that start out,
Yes.
and how did you kind of start building your own collection?
Well, even very early on, despite having both parents in the industry and always being around watches, I was never allowed to really handle watches because my father wanted to make sure that I could develop the proper appreciation for handling, an exquisite wristwatch before kind of giving me one. So when I was, very young, I was given an empty watch case and that was my watch and I wasn't allowed to have anything inside of it because I had to learn how to take care of the case before, getting an actual physical watch. But when I left university and moved back to New York in 2015 to help out my father, um, I moved back to New York pretty much a stranger to how everything was up in New York and to how the industry was in the terms of how it was modernizing, how things were changing, how different companies and people now were, getting involved into the mix. Because for me growing up, I had just really known everything that I was around through my family and not been exposed to much around that. And that was a lot in the manufacturer and retail side. But now, the collectors and auction houses and dealers, that was a whole new world to me. So moving back up to New York in 2015, I was pretty much a stranger to things. And I wanted to find ways to actively engage myself more in the community and get to learn more and get to meet people. And one of the great outlets for that in New York is the Red Bar community. And I had reached out to Adam and managed to go to a Red Bar on, one of the Wednesdays at the Honeycomb Hideout. And it was a very interesting experience for me. And the reason being, I walked into there a complete stranger, really not knowing anybody, and found the community just be so welcoming. One of the people that I met that first day was a man by the name of Nick Pardo, who I'm still very good friends with. Nick was a senior timepiece salesman over at Analog Shift, which is a vintage watch company based in New York City. And we had a fun little conversation. He asked me, he was like, it's so funny, you're Oscar Walden's son, right? I was like, yeah. He's like, I have something really cool to show you. And he brought me back over to his little area on the table where he had a watch roll. And in the watch roll, he took out a Tissot Navigator that I guess Analog Shift had. And he looked at me and goes, your father designed this, didn't he? I was like, wow, he did. Yeah. This was the watch, my father had designed the Tissot Navigator during his tenure at Tissot in 1953, 1954. And seeing it there was just kind of, mind blowing. And he was like, listen, this is such a cool watch. And, for me to be able to hold it and see it was just such a unique experience on its own because I had never seen one before. And he mentioned to me, he's like, come by the office the next day, we'll talk about it more. I'd really love to free to handle it. We'll kind of walk you through everything and, show you around the office. Cause I had no idea who Analog Shift was at the time. And I did, I went by the next day, we talked, and it was really cool because I fell in love with the watch. I ended up buying it. And as I left, this was such a fun experience to me. Somebody who, we're both very familiar and close with, Mr. Jeff Hess.
Yes,
who,
yes.
is such a close friend to me now, and somebody that I truly call a brother. Back then, somebody that I didn't know. I had never met him before. I had no idea who he was, and I had just bought the watch. And at the time, Jeff was the former CEO of Analog Shift, and he found out that I had just bought the watch. And in the most amazing, unique, and just completely unexpected act of generosity, Jeff just goes, "Oh, this is a beautiful watch. You know what? Hang on, I have something for you." And he runs up to his office and he comes down. And he comes down with this pristine little Tissot hang tag, but period correct from the 1950s. And he said, I want you to have this. And that for me was just such a monumental thing as not just a collector to now get, this really cool piece of ephemera to go with the watch, but also as somebody who my entire life on a personal basis, I've always felt like an outsider. No matter where I was, no matter who I was with in school and in college, I always felt like I was an outsider and I always felt like I didn't belong. Collecting community basically was just so warm and so receiving and something that I really wasn't used to. So to that simple little act of generosity there, went such a long way with me. And that kind of really led me down the rabbit hole of collecting. And I still have with me the watch. This is the Tissot Navigator.
Oh, that's so great. Look at that condition. And let's see the hang tag.
Of course, the hang tag is nicely next to the buckle.
Wow. I love that. I love that story. I love that you have the watch with you and you still have it. I think that's a really great point to make about the watch community because I think some people, again, are a little bit intimidated to get into not only the industry, but to buy their first watch or they're afraid to ask questions. But in my experience too, I've noticed the watch community is very welcoming. People want to answer questions and ask questions, and it's not like this scary beast all the time. Even on the auction side of things where I am, it's still very welcoming. I'm a new collector, I'm an amateur collector, and people are willing to help me learn. And that's what I need. And I love that. And it seems like across the board, that's the way it is, despite social media and everything else. People are very welcoming, and that's important to remember.
Social media and everything aside, this industry is based on passion. Whether it's, on the retail, manufacturing, or collecting side, this industry is based on passion. And that passion is what brings people together. And that's what creates such an inviting and welcoming community, because when people connect, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, doesn't matter, age gaps or difference or cultural barriers or anything like that. A watch and that passion for the watch is something mutual that people can connect, despite all of those differences, and it brings people together.
100%. And even just at the very basic level, people are connected by the concept of time. It's something that everyone has in their life. And no matter what, you'll always be connected with that. But speaking of passion, so what type of watches do you find yourself passionate for now in your collecting experience?
It's interesting because now I find myself very attracted to detail. And what I mean by detail is I look for small nuances or things that are sort of irregular or things that would be really unique. Because one thing that I've seen from both manufacturing and the collecting side is that there are so many watches between brands and between models that kind of look similar, or that, have similar, kind of cues. Like, the Pepsi bezel, for example, is very commonly used across, different brands. So I'll look for little dial differences. I look for history in the watch, little things like patina, as well too, where it's just, a tropicalization or discoloration of a dial because of its exposure to UV light, and then going back in the safe. That ties back to the history of the chemicals and the paint that they use, and the types of paint that these companies use for only a certain period of time. And being a history buff, I've always loved history. Now I'll look for those types of details when it comes to my collecting, and no matter how big or how small the watch. So I actually have another watch here with me as well too. This is a recent acquisition of mine, one of my now new time favorites. It's this small, very honest little Omega tank, but it has a crosshair dial and applied silver indices.
Wow. Okay. So yeah. So you like differences in the dial, and it was really exciting that you just said, I don't know if you saw my last video. I was talking about dirty dials and my appreciation for what I call dirty dials. It's like the same thing. It's a little bit different. It's a little bit edgy. It means that it's been worn, and I really appreciate that. And I think maybe you like some of the similar things too. Watches that have a little bit of a unique piece to them. One thing I found interesting when you and I had spoken earlier is that you basically started your watch collection by purchasing vintage watches, and then you moved on to modern watches, which to me is like reverse of what I think people would do. So if you can describe that experience and why you started buying vintage watches, and then moving on to modern.
Yeah, it's funny because typically it is the opposite. People, and not all, but a large amount of people gravitate more to modern pieces, and that kind of starts to work them backwards. And for me, I was exposed more to vintage at first. And that's what really, that whole first experience with, my first like real watch that I bought and collected for myself led me down this rabbit hole with vintage, because I'm a huge history buff. I absolutely love history. Being it that my father was, involved in World War II, and there was that history there. It's one of the things. European history was something that I studied in school, and I look for those similar elements when it comes to my collecting. So vintage watches just have so much more history to them. That's the originator. That's where kind of everything started. So one of the biggest things for me with vintage collecting, and why I started with vintage and then made my way over to modern, is because I was able to find those similar principles between vintage and modern. And as I built my vintage collection, I focused a lot, initially around vintage Rolex, getting into more, sort of obscure watches, just with more significant movements. So I was really buying watches that had certain types of movements, looking for like Valjoux 72s, Valjoux 88s, certain Lemania movements, because of their historical significance. And as I built my collection more, I was very worried about potential damage or anything like that could occur to the watch. So that's what led me to collecting modern, because then when I moved to modern watches for me was sort of the modern iteration of what I had collected in the vintage world that I could now wear on a daily basis without worry about that damage and stuff like that. So when I bought my GMT Master 2 Pepsi, which is a very, very hot watch now, the reason that I bought it was because I looked at that watch and I thought it was the coolest thing ever, because I had 4 reference 1675s, and I was able to look at the 1675s and see that this is exactly where this watch came from. And the reason that this modern GMT is the way that it is today is because of everything that transcended out of those original models there from the 1950s and 1960s.
That's so cool. I think that's such an interesting way of thinking about that. It's almost like a modern representation of all of the history that's built up in the past. And because you're such a history buff, that's important to you, but you can actually wear this one and bang it around and not feel scared that you're going to lose, your life savings. And one of my favorite questions to ask fellow collectors is, what collecting mistakes or purchase mistakes have you made in the past that you're willing to admit?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. The watch industry, I feel like, is one of a big part of the watch industry and collecting. is making mistakes. This is an industry where you learn by doing research and by, reading as much as possible and engaging with other collectors and, building that sort of knowledge base. But the other part of that experience and the other part of, building your knowledge in watch and watch collecting to me is through making mistakes. And early on, I had been a lot more compulsive, I would say, with some of my earlier purchases. And whereas I do, one of my principles of collecting is to always, and they say this all the time, is to buy what you love. But I think that you should also, when you find something that you love, you should also do your homework on it and make sure that it's correct. Because I'm very guilty of having, seen a watch and gotten compulsive and bought it because it looks beautiful and I think that it's all original, only to find out that, the dial's been refinished or the dial's been reloomed or this bezel doesn't actually belong on this watch. So I think it's very important to be able to do your homework, study, and to have patience, especially with younger collectors. One thing with the internet and social media, one advantage that it's given us is that everything is accessible there now, like when we want it to be. And sometimes that compulsion can carry over into our purchasing habits. So I think it's very important to slow down a little bit, do your homework, make sure everything's correct. Don't be afraid to ask questions and to ask questions to your friends and peers, because at the end of the day, one, great thing about all the other collectors in the industry, especially ones that you surround yourself with, is that they're there to help you.
You mentioned to me that you've bought and you sold, with dealers and also at auction houses. And I want to get your perspective on the auction house side of things. What are your suggestions for new collectors and maybe someone who is looking to purchase their first vintage watch at auction? What are your suggestions for someone buying at auction?
I think my first suggestion, first and foremost, would be to study. And one of the great advantages about working with auction houses is that they provide auction catalogs. And in these auction catalogs, there are, really formal descriptions and details about, the brand, about the history of the watch, about the particular watch on its own, the condition report, being such an important piece of material as well too. But I think it's really important for new collectors to study the watch and study why they want it. Going back to buy what you love, it's very easy to look at certain pieces at auction houses and get carried away with the price tag or the sort of glitz and glamour about it, but not to look at sort of the academic side of it. And I think in terms of collecting values, I think it's very important for collectors to make sure that they do their homework, because it's very easy to make mistakes. Secondly, I think it's very important to build relationships. Relationships in the watch industry are everything. It's a community of collectors and people who are, doing this based off of passion, talking to one another. And so with the auction houses, I think it's very important to build relationships with them, engage with people who work there, ask them questions. Don't be afraid to, go ahead and go in there as a novice and say that, hey, I don't necessarily really kind of know what I'm doing in the sense, but I'm looking for something in this range. I'm looking for something really nice for myself. Help walk me through this, and from the experiences that I've had, especially, with Phillips, being one of the auction houses that I've bought and sold through, is that the people there are so welcoming and willing to help you, and that's really all that you can ask for with people in the auction industry. And thirdly, this goes back to a little bit what I was saying before, is patience. I have made this mistake, and this goes back to the collecting mistake, because this happened for me at an auction house, and it is what it is. But I'm hoping that people will learn from my mistakes. I've made the mistake of early on looking at watches as, for just pure, investments in that sense, where I was sitting in an auction room and I saw a watch that, I think had one or two bids, and I was like, oh, this is a great steal or a great deal on this watch. If I buy this, I'll probably be able to, trim some sort of profit on it in like 1 or 2 years. And out of pure compulsion, without really having done my research, knowing it was, a watch, of some significance, but not having done the adequate research to know the full condition of it, I went ahead and submitted a bid and ended up winning the watch. And later realized that there was a big thumbprint on the dial that, I couldn't see initially. There were certain parts inside, one of the calendar wheels had been replaced and I wasn't fully aware of it. There was little, issues like that and it ended up giving me a big kick to the ego and a big kick to the wallet. So
Long story short, do your homework. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Absolutely. And be patient.
And be patient. Be patient.
Yes.
Good. Those are Good tenets to remember, I think.
Patience is a virtue, and for good reason.
For sure, 100%. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk briefly about your Waldan watches, Waldan International, if you will. You, again, recently kind of did a mini relaunch yesterday, which is super exciting. The one thing I love about your brand, it takes Swiss inspiration and it's kind of made its regrown from an American brand base now, which is super cool. And you're focused on an entry level collector, which of course is attractive to me, with attractive price points, but beautifully made watches, well made watches. And I wanted to know if your collecting experiences have shaped how you market your own watch brand to the world, especially with social media being such a big factor in things today.
It's interesting because now looking at watch brands, you know, the Swiss watch industry, and I think the watch industry overall is based on tradition. That's been, you know, sort of a common denominator across the board for all brands, for watches. It's carry forth tradition. But now things are so ever changing and so evolving in the 21st century. You know, we're seeing all of these things that, you know, traditionally the industry has not been exposed to, like social media and digital marketing, you know, and all these things that are now changing the landscape. And with social media, now comes accessibility. Now comes, you know, collectors and young collectors, people who are, you know, fresh and new to the mix, who want to learn more about watches. But for the most part, the watch industry sometimes can be a little bit of an intimidating place if you don't know the right people or you don't know where to go, and you just feel like a stranger, and you just kind of feel like a stranger. I finished my days at university and moved on to Waldan Watches now. And as my friends graduated, they would reach out to me and ask me more and more questions about watches, as they were now, you know, getting their first, you know, real jobs out of college, looking to buy something nice for themselves to make themselves presentable and professional in that sense, you know, with having a nice watch, and asking me those questions. And I felt a responsibility to make sure that I could answer those questions and give them as much as possible, because it's easy to dismiss somebody when they don't have a lot of money to spend on a watch, especially at a young age. But it's very important to remember that that generation, that group, that's the next generation of watch collectors and enthusiasts. And
This is the next collectors.
that's the next collectors, exactly, absolutely. And if we don't do our parts to educate them correctly, to be able to give them our time, and, you know, walk them through their questions and educate them and pay attention to them, you know, then there's going to be potential gaps in the market where, you know, these traditions and values that, you know, the watch industry has established for years and years and years are going to sort of fall through, because they won't be properly educated on what to buy, on what value is, on how to collect and how to appreciate watches. So I think it's very important that we pay attention to that next generation. And that's one thing that I focused on with my brand in terms of making it entry level, making it accessible, because we have this great history. We have this really great history that my father established. And typically something like that at the price point of what we would sell would be inaccessible to the everyday collector, to the new collector, to the next collector.
Exactly.
And I think that making that history open and accessible through an entry level, you know, sort of making my brand now, you know, focused around entry level price point pieces without sacrificing integrity and quality in manufacture, I think is what helps to bring in that next generation and educate them and get them to love watches, because they start off with something small now, you know, a couple, you know, watch that's, you know, $250 or, you know, $500, but then 10, 20, 30 years down the line, these are the guys who are going to be buying, guys and girls who are going to be buying nicer watches, and they're going to keep the industry going when we're not around.
Love how you put that. I 100% agree with you. You basically described the backbone of what I'm trying to do with the next collector. So of course I agree with everything that you're saying. It's making the seemingly inaccessible accessible where it was already accessible, but let's open the conversation and start asking questions and grow this next generation of collectors. The next collectors. I appreciate what you're doing with Waldan Watches. I think it's going to be a big hit. It already is. And I'm excited to see where it goes, which is great. And I want to end this lovely session off with a non-watch related question for you. Okay, are you ready?
I'm ready.
If you had to wear one color for the rest of your life, only that color, what would it be?
I think that color would probably have to be navy blue.
That is so boring, but I'll take it. Well, thank you, Andrew, so much. This was such a great conversation. I hope to speak with you again on the next collector. Obviously, I see you around the auction room at Phillips, and we see each other around town. So it was really great to hear your story, your backstory, and I am so excited for what's going to happen with Waldan Watches. I really am thrilled for you. So good luck with everything, and thank you again, and I will speak with you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me again, and looking forward to seeing you soon, Daniela.